four Gospels now have Jesus taken back to the city and interrogated before the high priest. Peter follows and waits in the courtyard. The servants will recognize him as an associate of Jesus, but Peter will deny all knowledge of him. However, from this point on in the narrative, while Matthew continues to follow Mark quite closely, with a few additions and subtractions, Luke's version starts to be significantly different. John's narrative, as we have seen, is already very different from the others. The differences seem to be more than just a matter of a dramatic or theological choice by the respective authors, though some of them almost certainly are. Luke and John really do seem to be relying on different traditions and snippets of report about how this day unfolded. We'll begin with Mark again. Peter follows the detachment at a distance and sits down with the servants by a fire in the courtyard of the high priest's house. The judgment theme now comes to the fore once again, with the roles starkly reversed. 2 days earlier, we saw Jesus seeing off his challengers from among the religious and political leaders in Jerusalem. Then we heard him deliver a prophetic judgment on the temple and the city. Now Jesus is without defense as he is interrogated by the high priest and his privy council. And in the end, they will deliver their judgment on him. In Mark's Gospel, the dramatic irony is especially clear to see. Mark has consistently created a dramatic tension around the identity and authenticity of Jesus. His actions and words have been read and misread throughout. Only those closest to him have been allowed to share in the knowledge of his identity as Messiah. Yet, only here, in this space of maximum vulnerability, will he finally declare his identity openly. Precisely where that declaration can only bring him judgment and death. Matthew and Mark present the meeting of the council as an informal trial. The council wants to condemn him to death, but they need solid reasons. However, they can find no coherent witnesses to blasphemy. The most promising candidate is a report that Jesus once said he would destroy the temple and in 3 days rebuild one not made by human hands, though even here the witnesses are conflicting. You might remember that we actually do hear Jesus saying just this early on in John's Gospel. John shows Jesus here as baffled by the claim at the time, but makes the point that after the resurrection, Jesus' disciples realized that he was talking about the temple of his body. The disciples, after the resurrection, are able to read Jesus' words and actions aright. So we find the same words reported at just this moment in Mark's Passion narrative. There may be confusion about their precise meaning and content among the hostile witnesses within the trial narrative. However, the knowing reader is invited to recognize the irony of this hostile report that contains a riddling promise of Jesus' own death and resurrection. Jesus responds to the charges with silence. Here too the scriptures are being fulfilled. The reader recognizes an echo of Isaiah's 4th servant song. Harshly dealt with, he bore it humbly. He never opened his mouth. But the high priest pushes for a response. Are you the Christ, Son of the Blessed One? Now, for the first time in the Gospel, and at the moment of maximum vulnerability, Jesus answers directly. I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sat at the right hand of power and arriving with the clouds of heaven. Not only does he claim to be the Christ, he claims to be the transcendent, messianic, one like a Son of Man of the book of Daniel, the one who will bring about the end time and rule in the name of God. This might have been the moment for divine vindication and affirmation. Instead, it is precisely at this moment, as he declares the full truth of his identity, that he is condemned as blasphemer, liable to the religious sanctions for blasphemy. The high priest tears his robes. The judgment that has been pending throughout the whole gospel narrative falls at last, and it falls on Jesus. Up to this point, Jesus has been treated as a mere suspect. Now he is a blasphemous criminal. The high priest's household has license to fall upon him in a chaotic scene of physical violence and mockery. The scene now switches to Peter's denials in the courtyard. A serving girl recognizes him. He mutters "I don't know what you're talking about," and moves to the outer courtyard. She pursues him and starts talking to the other bystanders about him. He denies all knowledge again. Now the bystanders, alerted, notice Peter's Galilean accent. Peter swears that he does not know the man. The cock crows. Peter remembers that Jesus had said this would happen and collapses in tears. In Luke, this all happens quickly, allowing him to add an extra layer of dramatic pathos at the moment of realization. He places the scene of the denials before the interrogation begins. As the cock crows, Jesus is about to enter the house of the high priest. He turns and looks directly at Peter. Then Peter remembers and weeps bitterly. As we can see then, Luke is restructuring the story and telling it differently in other respects as well. Jesus is indeed taken to the house of the high priest. However, there is no interrogation. He is simply held there overnight. There he is at the mercy of his captors, who need no excuse to insult him and mistreat him. It is only in the morning that the council is convened. Council is here spelt out as the senior leaders of the people. We may have an example of Luke trying to make sense of Mark, who talks about a second meeting of the Privy Council in the morning, where the decision is taken to send Jesus to the Roman governor. Luke follows Mark and Matthew in assigning responsibility on the council to chief priests, scribes, and elders. Pharisees are not named. Luke is well aware of the fall of Jerusalem and has presented it from within the gospel narrative as a future punishment for rejecting the Messiah. But he is also careful to identify those who are culpable for that rejection. They are not all Jesus' adversaries in religious disputation, but rather the power players of the Jerusalem elite. And that elite did indeed suffer in the course of the later revolt and the violent civil war that engulfed Jerusalem under siege. In contrast to Mark and Matthew, Luke seems to suggest that the interrogation before the council is nothing like a regular trial. There is no mention of witnesses except in passing at the end. Instead, Jesus' interrogators go straight to the point. Tell us if you are the Christ. This triggers a short passage of dialogue, signalling Jesus' reluctance to answer directly. If I tell you, you won't believe me. If I try to persuade you, you won't answer my questions. Instead, Jesus makes an oblique prophetic claim, invoking the familiar passage from Daniel. From now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. This statement, more ambiguous than in Matthew or Mark, does not immediately lead to his condemnation. His hearers press him. Are you then the Son of God? It is only when Jesus replies, It's you who are saying that I am, that they are satisfied. They, and they is the voice of the whole council, not of the high priest alone, they now have no need of witnesses. One thing that these two quasi-admissions has given them is that it allows the Jerusalem leadership to bring Jesus before the Roman governor, not as a religious transgressor, but as a political threat. He is Christ, a claim to political authority over the Jewish people, and therefore a challenge to Roman rule. And he is also Son of God, a title reserved to the Roman emperors, heirs of the divine Julius Caesar. When we turn to John, we find still more divergence. As so often in John, we get a sense of a deeper local knowledge than in the other accounts. But we also get some new disjointedness. The captain of the guard and the detachment take Jesus first to the house of Annas. He, we learn, is the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest of that year. The author reminds us that Caiaphas had spoken the prophetic words, "It is expedient that one man dies for the people." In a striking difference from the other Gospels, Peter is not following the guards on his own, but he is with another disciple, and that disciple is known to the high priest. Is this a literary device to explain how we know what happened in the trial? Is it another indication in John's Gospel that Jesus' followers included people from the higher levels of Jerusalem society? Or is the other disciple providing a role that the reader is invited to inhabit? We will see that, again in marked contrast to the other Gospels, the other disciple will accompany Jesus all the way to the cross. It is this other disciple who, through his connection to the high priest, is able to get Peter into the courtyard. But that act is also the reason why the servant girl watching asks Peter if he too belongs with Jesus. This provokes Jesus' first denial as he warms himself at the brazier with the rest. In John, the drama will switch backwards and forwards from events in the house to Peter in the courtyard. So next we go inside and follow a section of the interrogation led by the high priest, who questions Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answers back. He has spoken openly to the world, in the synagogues and temple, where the Judeans meet. World often appears in John in the positive sense. It is the beloved creation waiting to be rescued by the Son of God. But it is also often used in a negative sense, as it is here, to sum up the hostile human forces that refuse to recognize Jesus. We can also recognize a distancing language towards the Judeans, a reminder of the hints throughout John's Gospel that Jesus' movement belongs to a restored Israel, the whole people of God. So Jesus tells the high priest to ask his hearers what he said. The guard takes this as an insult and slaps him. Jesus challenges the guard to show what he has said was wrong. This tone of polite but steely defiance is very different from the silence of Matthew and Mark. There may be a dramatic echo of the tone of Socrates, the great philosophical martyr for the truth from 5th century Athens. In Plato's famous portrayal of his trial, Socrates too is uncompromisingly honest about his own integrity, even when his audience resent what they hear. After this, Annas sends him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. This seems disjointed. It seems that after all it was Annas, not Caiaphas, interrogating Jesus. But we can also notice one similarity with Luke's version of the story. Jesus is being transferred from one residence to another. The scene switches back to Peter in the courtyard. He is questioned a second time and a third time. The third time there is even more jeopardy. The person asking is a relative of the person Peter wounded in the olive grove. Peter once again denies all knowledge, and the cock crows. We are not given any insight into Peter's reaction by John, as we are in the other Gospels. However, in John's Gospel, there is an important mirror scene which the others don't have. In a later resurrection scene on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, we will see Peter being given a chance to unsay his denials. There Jesus will ask him 3 times, "Do you love me?" In each case, Peter will answer with increasing distress, "Lord, I am your friend." Jesus' reconciling words to him conclude with, "Follow me." We now see Jesus led from Caiaphas' house to the Roman governor's headquarters in Jerusalem. Notice how John tells us nothing about what went on when Jesus was before Caiaphas. No mention of Daniel or blasphemy. Has text got lost or been edited out? Neither is possible. As so often, the text of John's Gospel suggests multiple layers of editing. As many scholars suggest, it seems to have evolved as an open text. Now, if this is a deliberate omission, then it reflects an editorial choice. We might explain that choice from the dramatic structure of the whole Gospel, which is so different from Mark's. In Mark, Jesus' declaration, "I am," and the high priest's horrified reaction come as a clear dramatic high point in the whole narrative. But in John's Gospel, it would be no novelty. All the questions that come up in Mark's or Luke's version of the trial have already been presented in John's Gospel during the controversies of chapters 7, 8, and 10, along with Jesus' theologically intolerable responses. That sequence of increasingly aggressive interrogations comes to a climax in chapter 10. There, Jesus makes the extraordinary claim to his adversaries, "The Father and I are one." The response of the crowd is to pick up stones to stone him for blasphemy, but he escapes as they try to seize him. In John's Gospel, then, all the shocking claims about Jesus' identity are already public knowledge. Perhaps that is why John chooses to leave out any detail of the interrogation before Caiaphas. As he says to Annas, they only need to ask his hearers what he said. Thus, John can move straight to the scene where the leaders hand Jesus over to Pilate. There he will emphasize, perhaps more than the other writers, the political motivation for handing Jesus over to the Roman authorities. Jesus is a troublemaker whose actions and claims threaten to destabilize a delicate status quo. Disturbing that status quo is bad for the chief priests themselves, but it is also a genuine peril for the whole people. John's Caiaphas has already declared that one man must die for the sake of the whole people. The chief priests are go-betweens between the people of Judea and the Roman governor. Now we see them doing nothing more than their job. Thank you for listening, and see you next episode.